talking about a disease and specifically those 5 pathogens. You need to know each of those 5. You need to have a couple of examples of each of those 5. And I will point out a really important cram card I made up for that. You didn't have the handout last time, so you'll need to fill that in this time. But a disease obviously is a malfunction of one or more body systems, and that disrupts homeostasis. Now there's infectious and there are non-infectious diseases. We have a completely separate slideshow for non-infectious diseases. This slideshow looks at pathogens specifically. That's an agent that causes disease. It doesn't have to be a microbe, because that implies bacteria or something. It's just anything that can cause an infection, it can cause a disease. It can be cellular, which means alive, bacteria, protists, fungi. We don't do parasites in the Y09. They do cause disease, but we are interested in bacteria, protists and fungi. And non-cellular and definitely non-living pathogens are viruses and prions, which are about as small as you can get in terms of infectiousness. Now, a non-infectious disease, and you need to know these 2 for your presentation, okay? And you need to be able to define them. A non-infectious disease is not caused by disease-causing agent, so it's not transmissible. Genetic diseases are examples of this, like Down syndrome or haemophilia. Non-infectious diseases, genetic diseases, Down syndrome and haemophilia, or other things like that. There's about 6,000 of those. And lifestyle and environment also can cause disease. So if you're overweight through, probably a lack of exercise and poor diet, that is bad for your cardiovascular system and causes a breakdown of those organs over time. Diabetes can be a lifestyle disease if you're eating too much sugar. Cancer from smoking or exposure to chemicals are examples of diseases. Chemicals are mutagens, like petrol or cigarette smoke. They can cause damage to DNA, which in turn results in cancer, primarily as a disease. Okay. So those are the 3 reasons that we get disease. Pathogens, genetics or lifestyle, and of the pathogens there are 5 that we have to be familiar with, and then for genetic diseases you'll need to know some of those as well. But as I said, that's a completely different slideshow. Now, infectious disease, fine, caused by infectious agents. They are person-to-person transmissible, okay? Infection by infectious pathogens occurs when you get these infected body fluids. Vectors can carry things around, like mosquitoes, or in fact pretty much anything that carries an infectious agent around is classed as a vector. So when you have a cold, you're a vector. Airborne particles and droplets that get put out into the environment, and they get inhaled, or in some cases they might get through a break in the skin and be transmitted that way. Ingested, so basically ingested being eaten, inhaled being obviously inhaled, and enter an opening in the body through a cut or something like that. And so those are the main ways you can get sick. Now, if you know those things, then you can obviously avoid illness pretty easily by washing your hands is a big thing. Just generally being clean, having a clean environment, and straight away, and by clean environment I mean an environment that gets cleaned regularly, and it goes from there. If you don't put that phone away, an email will go home. You will not bring a phone ever again to school. So, that's an example there of different types of infectiousness. Now, if you are not value, you don't need to know, but different things are infectious in different ways. Hepatitis C, which is blood, and Ebola, which is body fluids, not particularly infectious. That little 2 means you typically infect 2 people. Okay, whereas HIV and SARS are 4 people. SARS sudden acquired respiratory syndrome, so it's basically a flu, but it's quite a dangerous one. And so there's an element of fatality there. Mumps, not particularly dangerous in a lot of respects, but a small percentage of people can die from that. But on average it will infect 10 people. And then measles goes all the way up to 18, which is highly, highly infectious. So it survives well in the environment, it jumps between people very easily through air, and so that's the classic scenario where someone walking through an airport could infect dozens of people if they're not vaccinated. Not particularly dangerous, but you can have lifelong problems caused by measles, and it will kill a percentage of people. So if everyone is infected, then potentially you could have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of deaths. The Spanish flu, I think I mentioned last week, only was fatal for about 5% of people, but it killed about 80 million people because it infected everyone on the planet. And that happened just after World War I. Okay. So now we're into the newer stuff. Right, the little plus and minus, you'll see those later. Plus means something benefits, minus means something has a negative outcome. And that's what parasites do. An organism which lives in or on another organism benefits by getting nutrients at the expense of that other organism. So, for example, tapeworm. Tapeworms live inside the organism. Fleas get a bit of blood on the outside. Not particularly an issue, but the pandemic, which is a global epidemic, which is an epidemic where lots of people get affected by something. The Black Death resulted in, well, it's hard to know exact numbers, but up to 200 million people, a third of Europe died.
About 30% to 60% of Europe.
About a third of Europe, they reckon, died from a bacteria. And the interesting thing is, of course, you'd know straight away that bacteria can be killed with antibiotics. So people today still get Black Death. It's still found in the United States. Typically that's where I hear stories from, not out of Europe so much. But I've heard of a number of people each year being infected with Black Death bacteria. And you just take antibiotics for a couple of weeks. Fine. Not a particular issue, but for the Middle Ages, absolutely history making and history changing. So there's that definition for vector we talked about. An agent, person, animal, microbe, or anything acellular, meaning not living, that carries and transmits an infectious pathogen into living organisms. So fleas and mosquitoes are things that immediately jump to mind, and it was fleas that were transmitting the Black Death. People thought it was cats and dogs, so they killed them. So it was actually fleas from rats that were transmitting from the rat into the humans. But people mistakenly thought it was cats and dogs, so they killed them en masse, which made the problem even worse. Obviously the Black Death occurred before bacteria had been discovered, before the invention of microscopes. So people couldn't see, had no idea that little things could cause infections. Here's a picture from around about that time, and you can see these huge swellings on people where, basically there's, I don't know the symptoms, the symptom and how the bacteria spreads, but I know that you get these big, basically lumps, and they would, in some cases, be pus-filled and quite unpleasant, and off it would go from there. And so, it was particularly brutal. When a third of the population dies, that means that many more people have been infected, and a third have died. The treatment at that time, in some cases, was that they would just close the city gates, and that's it. And they'd do that for months, if not longer. So they'd have a few people would bring food to the city, and it would be hoisted up, using primitive cranes and pulleys and things like that. But they would just seal the city. No one would get in. You could leave, but you couldn't come back. And they'd keep this up until the plague had gone through. That thing on the right is what a red blood cell would look like compared to bacteria or viruses. Okay? So pathogens are cellular, living things, and non-cellular. cellular pathogens, bacteria, protists, fungi, and parasites, and non-cellular viruses and prions. We don't do viroids and we don't do parasites, but that's a red blood cell. I think it's 10,000 nanometers, so 10,000 billionths of a metre, or 10,000 billionths of a metre, yes. And so you can see there's an E. coli bacteria, and that's pretty sizable, okay, compared to these other things, but very small compared to even a red blood cell, okay. But when you compare, there's Ebola, very nasty, and then you've got other things, viruses. There's a rhinovirus, meaning something like a cold virus, goes through your nose, hence rhino, and that is absolutely tiny. There's an adenovirus, there's bacteriophage, we'll look at those before, so they come in different shapes. A viroid is something that infects plants, so that's why we don't do it. Poliovirus, very, very nasty, absolutely tiny, only a few genes, and yet capable of causing incredible damage to interneurons and even motor neurons. Actually, no, I think it's exclusively motor neurons, I'm wrong there. So it'll cause paralysis, and if the infection is bad enough, it'll paralyse the muscles that you need for breathing. And so you end up in a situation where people will be in an iron lung. Maybe they got polio as a child. A year or two ago, one of the longest survivors of polio in an iron lung, if not the longest, died. And they'd spent, from their childhood, their entire life, in a device that uses pressure to expand their ribs so they can breathe and then compress. Expand, compressed. Yes?
My granny had polio when she was a little girl.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of people who did, they were maybe paralysed in an arm, or they might have weakness in a limb. Some people were fine, but some people were affected really badly. And the interesting thing is, of course, with the advent of vaccines, polio is not an issue. And so, like, people of your grandmother's time had polio, knew people who had polio, had maybe friends from school who died from polio. So they tell you horror stories about what a world with polio was like. And with vaccines, we don't have that anymore. And now people have the luxury, I suppose, in some parts of Australia and outside of Sydney, where they question whether or not vaccines are effective because they've never actually seen these horrifying illnesses happen, because no one they know or have grown up with has ever had polio or any one of a number of other really pretty terrible diseases. That's a really, 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 really important slide. That's basically your cram card for this topic for the exam for pathogens. Okay? You can see in each case I've defined what the pathogen is. I have provided a couple of examples of that pathogen, and I've even included some pictures here because in the case of bacteria, they come in different shapes, and that's important. They can be cocci, the spherical ones, spirals, those ones there, spirella, or rod-shaped bacilli. And then you've got protists, fungi. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with mushrooms, but they can be single-celled as well. Viruses, and then prions are just a naked protein. So we don't have pictures of them or anything like that in a real sense. You can do something with scanning tunnelling microscopes, but they're or possibly electron microscopes, but they're just misfolded proteins. So we'll go through each of those on the next few slides, but that particular slide you need to really, really, really be on top of. Okay. This is from year 8. So I've put this up. I didn't teach you last year, but I put this up for the prokaryotic and the eukaryotic bit. Prokaryotic cells, they don't have membranes inside. All of the stuff inside the cell just floats around freely. Okay, so there's no nuclear membrane or anything like that, just the DNA just floats around. But for eukaryotic, that actually means true nucleus. That's the type of cell you have and all animals and plants have. Okay? Hopefully this is a revision. And with eukaryotic cells, you do have a true nucleus. Everything is stored in little bags, if you like, organelles, and it keeps everything close to where the chemicals that it needs. And so the cells are larger, they can be larger, and still everything gets done. And so the interesting thing is, these types of cells are very different. Bacterial cells are very different to human cells. So it's easy to make drugs to kill them. Okay, they're pretty tough. Okay, but because they've got many differences between our cells and their cells, if you make a drug like penicillin that attacks, there's a compound in here called peptidoglycan, and penicillin destroys peptidoglycan. And so the bacteria can't repair its cell membrane or cell wall, and it dies. But you don't have peptidoglycan in your body anywhere. So you can eat penicillin all day, you're fine. It just goes through you, it doesn't affect you. Yes?
Don't you have bacteria in your stomach? though?
It'll kill them, but it won't kill your cells.
But don't you need them to eat?
Sure, but what I'm saying is your cells, when something is poisonous to you or at the level of cells, breaks down critical structures, it'll kill you. This is why cancer is hard to treat, because the cells are your cells. So they're identical in a lot of ways to your cells. So any drug that can kill the cancer will also start to kill you. But what I'm saying here is because of the many differences to bacteria and because of the presence of peptidoglycan, then you can actually consume compounds that destroy peptidoglycan and you're fine. Yes?
If the cancer hasn't spread as far, is it possible? Do they just like freeze the cell?
No, you don't want to fragment it, you want to cut it out. And then there are actually novel treatments like, what they can do is cancers are really hungry for glucose. So you take really tiny particles of gold and you attach them to glucose and then put them in the area where the cancer is, and it'll just suck that up like crazy. And then you use very, very specific radiation, like localized to that area. And when you heat metal, it heats up really rapidly compared to all the other tissue around it. So the cancer cells have heaps of glucose with gold in them, and they burst. Whereas the cells right beside them are unaffected by the radiation. So it's really exotic. That's only a year or so old. But they don't typically freeze. They'll remove with surgery. They'll hit with radiation in case they've missed something in the localized area. But the danger with cancers is maybe a cell or two has escaped, landed somewhere else and started making copies of itself. So, but we'll talk about how we can use bacteria to kill cancers, because they've done that too, and it's really effective. Okay, bacteria. Ubiquitous means found everywhere, and they are. 5 kilometres into the crust, up into the air, and everything in between, bacteria. They were here when the world, just after the world cooled long enough to get liquid water, and you could nuke every inch of the planet and it just wouldn't affect them in a meaningful sense. Sure, you'd make a mess on the surface and eliminate pretty much all ability for life to survive there, but give it a few million years and the bacteria would seep through again. Okay, that's what this is for. That's a sonic screwdriver from Doctor Who. Bacteria are time travellers. Some of them will produce spores that are heat resistant, radiation resistant, time resistant. And when I say time resistant, there is no other structure on Earth that's even close to the 60 million years that they can do. Okay, that's what they know of so far. So for a bacteria, what they can do is fold themselves up into this spore and wait indefinitely until conditions change. And maybe a little bit of glucose touching the outside of the spore will make a switch click, and then the bacteria will unfold itself and just business as usual. So they have found ancient bacteria that were there sharing the world with dinosaurs, and they've just reanimated them. Give them a bit of media with a little bit of sugar in there, and off they go. You know, so they are quite extraordinary. They come in 3 shapes: cockeye, spiral. Those are the ones I mentioned before that are highly dangerous. Rod-shaped, appear singly or in chains, can be free-living, or they can be parasites. Okay. You don't need to know all of the blue things. Okay, there's different types of bacteria. Some of them survive well in oxygen. Some of them absolutely don't survive in oxygen at all, and it's lethal to them. And so they survive in all these different types of environments. Obviously, they're responsible for things going bad, food going bad, things like that. So if you can eliminate them, the food will not go bad. And that's why you can freeze a mammoth for 10,000 years or 20,000 years. No liquid water if it's frozen, so the meat will just stay there and stay and stay and stay. And then if you cut some off and cook it up, you should be okay. Okay, hopefully it doesn't have some strange bacterial mammoth parasite that infects your gut. But when they did it with dogs, the first mammoth that they found, they did cut off meat, defrosted it and gave it to the dogs and they were fine. Okay, so you should be okay. If you cook it, even more so.
Oh, God.
Examples. Tuberculosis is caused by Bacterium tuberculosis. Highly dangerous. It destroys lung cells. And so if you are infected with that, you cough and you cough, which spreads the spores around. And the lung cells are destroyed, one by one, into their thousands, into their millions. And you suffocate ultimately because you just can't get enough air into your system anymore. Treated with antibiotics, fantastic. But because of misuse of antibiotics, feeding it to cows and pigs, tuberculosis, some strains of it now are completely resistant to every antibiotic, including antibiotics of last resort. And those are antibiotics in Australia which are locked up. You need 3 doctors to approve them. It's if you're infected with something absolutely monstrous. And in some countries like China, they feed them to animals. And that then gets into the animals' poop. They poop the antibiotics out as well. That gets out into the ecosystem. Bacteria share genes between them, and it slowly but surely moves its way through. Or another case with tuberculosis in Russian prisons. Tuberculosis, you need a 6-month course of antibiotics to kill it. Yeah? And in Russian prisons, where people are crowded together, they would typically only give them antibiotics for 2 weeks, which would just make the bacteria immune to antibiotics. You're breeding a bacteria that is becoming more and more difficult to kill. And so because of misuses, specifically in South Korea that I was reading about, and in Russia, because in South Korea people were just buying antibiotics over the counter. And, got a bit of a sniffle, antibiotics for 2 days. Yeah? And because of those misuses and in animal feeds, you're getting strains of bacteria that 70 years ago were absolutely deadly. And then with antibiotics coming through in the 50s, fantastic, golden age, 50 years, 2 generations, where you didn't have to worry about them. And now we're losing that now, and where you will have to be concerned about things like that, which is not great. Pneumonia is a funny thing. Pneumonia is anything that is infecting your lungs and causing damage and causing problems. It can be bacterial or viral, or possibly even fungal. You would hope not. So in this case, this is bacterial pneumonia. 3.5 million people died from that each year. Just your lungs not working, cough, 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 cough. Okay, if you don't have access to antibiotics, you're in trouble. Tetanus is extremely dangerous, 60% fatal. If you have tetanus, you'll get lockjaw, which you've probably heard of, but it actually affects all the muscles in your body, and literally you will snap bones in your body when you have the seizures. Your muscles will contract so hard it will break bones, and it is a really dreadful way to die. And yeah, apparently I've had tetanus because I got lockjaw in South Korea when I cut my hand on metal. And 2 days later I was sitting there eating, going, oh, teeth feel funny. It's because my gums were swelling, so my teeth moved out of alignment, and I couldn't open my mouth properly, and all of my joints in my body were really sore. And I went to a doctor, but they couldn't understand what I was trying to tell them. And so they just sent me off on my merry way, so I thought, this is just silly. And I only found out afterwards how dangerous it was. Like, really dangerous, 60% fatal. So I was part of the lucky 40%, yes.
Can't cats give you tetanus if they bite you and they break your skin?
Rabies.
No, they can't give you rabies in Australia because we don't have it. I'm not sure for tetanus. Typically what they look for with tetanus is it exists in soil, for example. So if the cat had been eating soil, I guess. This is why if you stand on a nail, you'll probably go to the hospital and they'll give you a booster shot just in case. How long was it since your last tetanus shot? And they'll go, it's about 10 years is what the vaccine is good for, so they'll give you a booster just in case. Because it's cheap, it's easy to give the booster. Cholera is still out there, will always be out there, comes from human feces. 100,000 to 120,000 deaths annually. I think I mentioned that it reverses your intestines.
Yep.
Oh,
Action of your intestines. Yeah.
So it
Oh,
doesn't it make the
that was gross.
water actually not?
Yeah. The large intestine, instead of absorbing water from your food,
It actually
absorbs water from your body.
and then makes
And
everything.
then it kills
And
it.
so-
So first you get diarrhea and then dehydration.
Yeah, you have diarrhea after diarrhea after diarrhea. So you're infecting your bedding, your clothes, anyone who's trying to help you, any water that's around, you're infecting. And that's how it spreads. So it's really contagious. Really contagious,
So-
dangerously so. So what happens sometimes after a natural disaster, sewerage pipes burst, contaminate water supplies, get into the street, and off it goes. And so maybe the earthquake killed 5 people, and then cholera comes through and kills tens of thousands if you're not on top of it. It is really, really dangerous, very nasty. So that's an easy one to remember. Protists, don't worry about all the blue ones, it's just there for completeness. There's lots of different types, I mean heaps. More species than we even have any idea of. Single cell, eukaryotic, that eukaryotic again, so that is the same cell as us. Bacteria are prokaryotic, so they've got that very different type of cell. But single cell eukaryotic organisms, same type of cells as us, plant and animal characteristics, they're sometimes called protozoa. This little picture here, you can see this one has chloroplasts. So it's got a little whippy tail, flagella for swimming, so it actively swims, but at the same time it conducts photosynthesis. And so that little tail, it runs a simple little computer program where it'll basically swim and then randomly turn and swim, and if it gets darker, it'll stop, turn, swim. If it gets darker, stop, turn, swim, and keep stopping and turning until when you swim, you get more light. Then don't turn, and swim some more, and check, and if you're getting more light, don't turn, swim, and that way you're getting towards sunlight, which is what you need for photosynthesis. Or if you're a hunter, you're going to hunt other things that photosynthesize or eat those. So it's got this very primitive eye spot there that just detects light. Is it brighter than before or less bright than before? And go. Amoebas are the ones we'll look at because amoebas, when I was growing up, they put them in books as the smallest animal. They only have a single cell, but they're not an animal, they're a protist. They do have a cell like ours though, a eukaryotic cell. Okay. Now, there are some examples. Malaria, you're probably familiar with. There's someone in the room who's doing malaria, I imagine. And it's Plasmodium protozoa. Kills a bunch of people every year, between 1 million and 2 million people each year. And it's transmitted by mosquitoes acting as a vector. So if you're infected with it, it'll start to destroy your blood cells and probably your liver as well. And then if a mosquito bites you, it can carry it to another person who gets infected.
Wasn't there a massive outbreak of malaria in Rio back in 2016 around the time?
Oh, I'd be guessing if I said I knew that. But yeah, the danger with climate change is that mosquitoes that carry malaria will be able to get into areas that they previously haven't. And so tropical mosquitoes will end up moving as the tropics move. And so the areas and countries that have no exposure to malaria before will get it. Sleeping sickness caused by the tsetse fly in Africa affects the nervous system. Lethargy, just a person can't wake up and they eventually die. Amoeba, or amoebic meningoencephalitis. Encephalitis basically means interneurons, which are which types of cells? Thinking.
Cells that are
Thinking and
reaction.
not reaction. Which type of cells? Should be
Neurons.
neurons, spine, brain. That's interneurons. Spine and brain are affected. They cause inflammation of those. I mentioned, I think, last time that the stories I see of these, they're 95% fatal, so they're extremely dangerous, and it's typically teenagers that die. Because when you get really warm weather in the United States for a long period of time, and people go for a swim in a pond where the water doesn't move very much, and these things have started to multiply out, and if you get some water up your nose, it can maybe cross through a break in the skin, infect you, get into your brain, and then just sets up house and just starts making copies of itself. Okay, and obviously that's damaging, and it's destroying brain cells as it does this. Or garden hose even. A boy was squirted in the face with a garden hose which had some warm water in there, and that was enough to get him infected with that particular amoeba. So they're extremely dangerous. So remember malaria if you can. Sleeping sickness is pretty easy. Less easy than encephalitis, but possible. Fungi are important. Not a plant, not an animal. They're a completely different kingdom. Okay, they're one of the 6 kingdoms you studied in year 7. Again, they're eukaryotic. They can be single-celled or multi-celled. Okay, so multi-celled like a mushroom or a toadstool. Okay, so something very visible. Single-celled like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is, whether you know it or not, one of your favourite microbes, probably your most favourite microbe. Humans have been using yeast for about 10,000 years to make bread, which isn't flat, so it's all fluffy and delicious. Yay, yeast. To make beer, none of you should have tried that because you're all minors. So, but eventually one day, I do not like beer, I do not like the taste, but a lot of people do. So that's 2 for 2, and guess what? Impossible burger. That's the organism, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that they put the heme gene from the soy plant into yeast, and now it makes leg hemoglobin, which they then put into the burger, which makes it delicious. Okay, so yeast, 3 for 3, 3 wins for 3. So well done. And they've got different plants. They're parasites on animals as well and plants. They don't really affect us too much, and that's very fortunate because they're eukaryotic cells, which means their cells are really similar to ours. But I will show you a video at the end of class of a man who gets a nasty nasal infection from a yeast, and the treatment is amputation of his face. So nose, eyeballs, cheeks, upper lip, gum,
I would rather die.
all the way back to the brain.
I would rather die.
And yes, that's what people say typically. But
Properly.
well, he still has a quality of life now, and his relationship with his wife is very strong. But that particular story is disturbing because he woke up feeling a bit under the weather. Within a couple of hours, he was at hospital. Within a couple of hours after that, he had the choice of that treatment, complete amputation, or he'd be dead before the next morning. So that's how quickly fungi move. Yeah, when fungi infect, you've seen how quickly fungi can grow. They put those hyphae out and go and typically they don't infect us, but it does happen from time to time. It's very rare, and you need to move really fast to stop them. Yes?
The largest living
Is also a fungi,
thing,
yes.
Yeah, it's massive fungi.
Yeah, I think it's this massive fungi under a forest. I think it's
Yeah.
10,000 tonne or something.
Yeah.
It is massive. It's the one fungi that's just spread out, and it's incredibly old as well. So, very important, highlight that point. Fungi are really important for breaking down nutrients that are trapped in dead bodies of one kind or another, and releasing it into the environment. Okay? So, unlike you're pretty selfish when you eat stuff. Your enzymes for digestion are inside your body, whereas fungi, the enzymes go out of their bodies and spread in the environment. And they absorb some of the nutrients, but the rest of the nutrients go into the soil and then are used by other organisms. So extremely important. That's one of their many jobs. Here are some common diseases. So you can see there a bit of athlete's foot down the bottom. Okay, that's not watermelon. That's underneath someone's toe, where the toe is splitting and the skin's going all cheesy. Yeah? And that's why you're supposed to wear thongs or sandals when you go in showers in swimming pools and things like that. Because
Swimming pool.
in the showers.
I thought you just said a swimming pool.
The showers at swimming pools.
Oh.
Okay, any public bathing facilities, you should wear thongs because these guys will spread, and you'll probably shrug it off. You've probably stood on them 100 times and you haven't even noticed. But, right day, right place, right time, bit of damp socks as you're walking around, go in your shoes so the environment's just right for them. And you might get this sort of thing going on. And normally you just hit it with a bit of mercurochrome or some iodine or something like that, and keep your feet pretty clean and dry, and you're fine, you know. The one on the right is ringworm. So ringworm is not a worm, it's a fungi. Effectively, you've got a toadstool ring under your skin. It's spreading out, spreading out, spreading out, spreading out.
My dad has that.
Yeah, it's not a worm. Like ringworm sounds like a really, I don't like the idea of that. But it's just a fungi, and you can treat that. It's not too bad. So they live in your body pretty benignly. Mouth, you've got a few cells there, different parts of your body. You'll be fine. Yes.
So fungi have the power to take over the world, but they don't.
Pretty much.
No, that's kind.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, okay.
Okay, thanks. So
Thanks,
yeah,
fungi.
fungi, if they did infect us, would be in trouble. Now we're going to try and do a crack this week. We'll look at some mouldy bread. I mean, you've seen mouldy bread. It's a bit furry looking, yeah?
Yeah.
And that's what fungi are doing. Hyphae. Now, if you look at the trees outside, you'll go, they have roots, which are a specialised structure. They have the trunk, they have the branches, they have the leaves. They're all doing these different jobs. Whereas fungi don't do that. They just do hyphae, and hyphae. Long story short. So, you see down here, these are rhizoid hyphae. They act like roots, but they're not roots. They're just hyphae that absorb nutrients. Then you've got aerial hyphae here, which raise things up in the air, like when you want to drop some spores off. So inside these sporangiospores, these sporangia here, you've got little spore structures, and that's what get released. Now, in a mushroom, the sporangiophore is the head of the mushroom. Okay, it's that big thing you see, and it drops spores out the bottom. But on bread mould, if you look closely enough, you'll see these little furry structures standing up. And this is typically the green thing that you see. So when a fungi runs out of food, like the cells in the middle have run out of nutrients, and so they'll shoot this hyphae up, generate some spores, and then they'll spit them out into the wind. And hopefully it'll land on something that they can use, and they'll go from there. Question? No. And so, but in every case, they're using hyphae as the structures that they use to achieve this. Yeah. So we'll hopefully get a look at those using the microscopes this week. But I need to finish up the introductory stuff so that when you have for your holiday homework and you're doing your presentations, the other homework will be the podcasts. But you want to get your presentation pretty much done by the time we come back. So that, because it takes at least 2 lessons to get through the presentation. Okay. And you'll need to submit those. So we'll work that out, but you can certainly start that now. That's your only homework. Okay, we'll watch this video at the end. This is a man whose face was ultimately, it wasn't consumed, they had to remove the face. That's the one I talked about.
So is this going to give me nightmares?
Probably not.
You still have nightmares?
And, okay, here's the next one. Viruses, okay? Non-cellular infectious agents that consist of DNA or RNA in some simple cases. And we'll watch a cell of this, how viruses go about infecting. But long story short, highlight that underlined part, viruses have to infect other cells. So they're non-cellular, they're not alive. That's what non-cellular means. They are not alive in any way. They have to infect a host cell, get inside, and then that cell, they use that cell to make copies of themselves. Copy after copy after copy after copy. Now, a cold virus is pretty gentle with you. It infects your lung cells, and then the virus particles get released without too much damage to your cell, and you cough them out and start spreading the cold virus everywhere. And so that's pretty benign. But some viruses, they cause the cell to burst, which means it is dead and it has to be replaced. Okay? And if enough of those cells are burst, if the damage is significant enough, it's going to really impact you. So you need to be aware that they have to be within a host cell to replicate. So technically viruses aren't alive, and the only cells they can get into, they have to have receptors for them. So we'll watch an interesting little video. where the virus from the movie Contagion, it's a really nasty, effectively a flu virus, but it infects only lung cells and interneurons, spine and brain, and it causes those cells to burst. So it does enormous damage to the spine and the brain. And so there's one part where a person has died at home and they're doing an autopsy. It's Gwyneth Paltrow actually, because they're saying, oh well, she's died under unusual circumstances. Perform an autopsy, they remove the top of her head and to look at the brain tissue to see impacts. And you see the people who perform autopsies, coroner, and he just says to his assistant, step back from the table. And the guy goes, what? He goes, step back from the table. And they just walk back like this, and they call the CDC in, and because they have no idea how contagious this thing is, and the damage is extensive. And that's a very interesting movie because it's realistic. The only treatment they have is everyone stay home. There's no helicopters, there's no motorcycle chases, no one jumps onto a train. None of that happens. Stay home. The military will bring food to you. If you go outside, you'll be arrested or possibly shot. Okay, it's really serious. You're not to move around because that's how it's spreading. And it takes them about a year in the movie to get on top of it, to get enough vaccine produced and then distributed that they start to push it back. Okay, but so it's quite realistic.
Wait, what's the movie called?
It's called Contagion. We'll watch a couple of clips from it where you see how the virus comes about. And here's some more on viruses. That's the same information. This gives you an example of how viruses move. It has to attach to a cell that has the receptor for that virus. Okay, that's a key point. And then once it gets inside, the cell itself will make copies. In this case, the cell is being destroyed. The virus is bursting out and spreading through the system, and the cell is being destroyed. So each cell might produce tens of thousands of copies before the cell actually bursts. And so your immune system is going to struggle to get on top of that, but it will. This is an interesting little page. This is an adenovirus. Now, that one there is HIV, so you've got this idea of a coat, and you've got DNA inside. This one is the closest thing that nature's ever produced to a little lunar lander. Okay, that's a bacteriophage. It actually attacks bacteria. So they have used these to treat disease. Okay, so they, instead of using antibiotics, if you know what type of, this will only attack, you know, if you find the right species, it will only attack a certain type of bacteria. So you're immune to it. And so the Russians have been very successful with this. And what it will do with those little legs, if it finds the right bacteria, it'll grab a hold of the outer cell membrane, it'll pull itself in, it'll jam that little base plate down, so it's got those little spikes in it, and then that whole thing here will retract like a syringe, and it will drive a needle right through the membrane. So it's basically a mobile needle, and then it will squirt its DNA into the target cell, and off it'll go from there. So it's like a hell spider. It doesn't have fangs. It carries an enormous needle inside it, which it just jams into things, suitable bacterial targets. Okay. This is an interesting little bit on HIV. Just an aside. See that CD4 receptor there? Viruses only can get into cells that have the receptors. So the CD4 receptor is needed for the HIV virus to attach and insert the viral genome into the cell. If you don't have the CD4 receptor, you're immune to HIV. Okay? You could be injected with a litre of blood and you would not get HIV. You can't. The virus can't gain access. 1% of humans lack a CD4 receptor. They're all of Swedish descent. So if HIV was airborne, the entire population of the Earth would have died off, except for about 50 million people of Swedish descent. Yes?
Why do people have the CD4 cell receptor in the first place?
Oh, it's just literally I couldn't tell you what's supposed to dock there, maybe a hormone or something like that. I literally couldn't tell you that. That's a really good question. But I do know if you don't have it, HIV can't gain entry. 2 people in history have been cured of HIV, but they also had cancer. So, no, it didn't cause cancer. The HIV infects T cells, and they are made in bone marrow. These people have leukemia, so the treatment for leukemia is to kill their bone marrow and then replace it with donor bone marrow. It's stock standard treatment, yeah? And what they did was, they found a suitable donor who was also of Swedish descent and didn't have a CD4 receptor. So what they did was they killed their bone marrow, replaced it with bone marrow from a donor who was immune to HIV, and when that bone marrow started producing blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells and T cells, the HIV could not infect those T cells, and they became cured of HIV. They're not sure if they can give HIV to another person. They cannot detect any in their blood. But as far as they can tell, they will live a completely normal drug-free life because they've taken them off drugs and they do not have their viral load increase over time. Their HIV is undetectable. So it's novel but really expensive. So you're not going to see that as a standard cure. Here are some examples. Measles, mumps and rubella are easy ones to remember. The MMR vaccine protects you and me from those. There are lots of different viruses. Herpes type 1 and type 2. Herpes type 1 is the one you get on a lip or a mouth typically, and that's a virus. It survives for life. Rabies is a bit unusual. Remember, you need to have a couple of examples of each virus. AIDS is an easy one to remember, or each pathogen. So measles, rabies is the one that inflames the brain, causes extreme aggression. So you'll be walking along, living your life in North America, and you get attacked by a squirrel. Because it just comes running at you and wants to bite you. What a novel way. So the virus is changing behaviour. So it's the closest thing to a zombie virus that you have. Because it changes the behaviour of animals, and they will run. So if you get bitten by a bat, or a squirrel, or a fox, or something like that, in Europe or the United States, you're going to get a rabies shot. Because once you start showing symptoms, they can't treat it anymore. Yes?
What about the zombie egg virus?
No, that's a fungus. I'm pretty sure that the one that affects ant behaviour and leads to them climbing up trees and stuff like that. That's a fungus because it sprouts out of their body. Yeah. So there is another one. I can't remember if it's a virus. I think it's a bacteria that affects the behaviour of rats, so they become fearless. So the rat runs around, not hiding as it would normally, and cats get them. And they eat them, and now the cat's infected. And then the cat poops. The cat poops, and rats will eat cat feces, and then they get infected. So it's got this complicated life cycle. And you go, yeah, Mr. Maz, so what's the big deal? Because they think that pathogen also infects humans. A third of humans are infected, and it may be changing your behaviour. And this is a brand new branch of science. Can bacteria and viruses change the way you act so that you infect other people? So are you making decisions because you've decided that thing? Or is there a bacteria somewhere pulling the strings, or potentially a fungi, making you engage a behaviour that's a little more risky than you would normally, and therefore potentially infect other people? Okay, brand new branch of science. Only a couple of years old. This is the last one. We'll get through this and then I'll take questions. Prions are infectious proteins. Now, when I mentioned this before, I think someone asked me, can't we have a drug that fixes this? No. Prions are so small. There's no DNA, there's no RNA, there's no membrane, there is nothing. It's a tiny little piece of protein. Just a fragment of protein. But if it bumps into a healthy protein of a similar configuration, it will change that one into an infectious protein. And now you've got 2 of them. And it takes about 20 years for you to show symptoms, but if you were infected, it will kill you. There is no treatment, and it causes, in fact, we call it mad cow disease, but really what it's doing is destroying your brain cells. Okay? So you have holes in your brain. Yes?
Just kill a bunch of protein.
No, you can't. And there is no target for the drug. So when cells containing prions burst, more of these infectious proteins are released and infect other cells. Okay? So on the left here is theoretically what is a healthy looking protein. You've got these weird helices and tangled areas. So it's just amino acids, a line of amino acids. And this one is the infectious one. And you can be infected by eating contaminated meat. So a contaminated cow, the meat could infect you.
I'm sure they're vegetarian.
But if you're really unlucky, from birth, you might carry a mutation that produces that protein. And so from birth, and that's called, I think it's fatal familial syndrome. Usually you live long enough to have children, and then you start to show symptoms.
And then you die.
And then you die. And it's not great. You can see here, this is normal brain cells, and this is different types. Scapie affects sheep. Kuri, you see in New Guinea natives, who part of their culture would be to eat deceased family members.
Oh my god.
Okay,
Whoa.
so it's
Sorry,
part of their
cannibal.
culture. Not so much anymore, but that if the family member may have died from effectively mad cow disease, and then you've transmitted it to every other member of the family as well.
Oh my god.
So, not particularly pleasant. So,
Oh my god.
bovine spongiform encephalopathy is mad cow disease, and it's called scapie in sheep. Now, this is an important story. In Australia, if at an abattoir a cow presents and it's shaking and it can't stand up, that's a classic symptom of mad cow disease. It may have been fed contaminated meat products to make it grow faster. Yes, ground up cow brains or sheep brains put into the feed to make it grow faster. Not a safe practice. And the abattoir, they report this, and they'll be paid money by the government to not slaughter that cow. Obviously, it's dangerous. 20 or 30 years down the road, you could infect dozens of people, or a dozen of people could be impacted by the disease. But in the United States, the government under the Bush administration stopped making those payments. And so an abattoir sitting there with a cow that's worth $1,000, someone's going to be out of pocket $1,000. If they slaughter it, it'll be 20 or 30 years. The foreman will be dead from old age by that stage. 20 or 30 years before people may or may not show symptoms. And so the impetus is not on people to do the right thing under that. It's highly dangerous. So bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease. When they say spongiform, they mean the brain becomes like a sponge. It's got holes in it, and you lose function and memory, and it is brutal. And I actually know a person whose mother died of the fatal familial insomnia. And what they mean by that is, one of the symptoms is you can't sleep, and your body's firing and doing odd things in response. It's detected that something's wrong, it just doesn't know what it might be. And that particular person was too scared to have themselves genetically tested to see if they might have that as well, which is one of these unusual situations. Nothing they could do about it if you were to return positive from that test. So would you like to know, not like to know? It's a tough call, but that is a particularly nasty disease. Now, I think we're just about, oh yeah, that's in a revision thing, that's the one you're going to have to know. Then we've got some practice questions there, but I'll stop there, and maybe we'll be able to watch a quick little video. Oh, no, not